All right, I hope you enjoyed those extra 5 minutes. You're welcome, you're welcome. Again, happy anniversary. We are on item 2F, and this is our last educator prep item for today before we go into closed session. Item 2F is the initial plan to develop a special education, CalTPA, as a performance assessment requirement for initial licensure of education specialist candidates. This item is being presented by Amy Rising and James Webb. Welcome, James, to your first presentation. This is an information action item. Ms. Rising, will you please begin?
Yes, good afternoon, commissioners. All right, so the item before us is going to present a plan for the development of a teaching performance assessment for our education specialists, as well as a summary of the feedback from our focus groups that we conducted throughout the fall and into the winter. And then we're also going to talk a little bit about our assessment design standards. We have a few opportunities in that document to update that language to help us move forward with the development of the education specialist teaching performance assessment. So those two things. So let's start with a little background. Quite a bit has happened with you over the last several years here in regard to education specialist credentials and the structure. So going back to the fall of 2016, there was a formation of what we called at that time the Preliminary Education Specialist Credential Work Group. This group is provided for you in Appendix A. And between October 2016 and August 2017, they developed a basic set of program standards and teaching performance expectations for the specialist credentials. At that time, at the December 2017 meeting, staff brought forward the proposal that education specialists would take and pass a teaching performance assessment once new programs were approved. Moving on then in time, at the 2018 meeting, that February meeting, you adopted a revised credential structure for the education specialist teaching credentials and moved to having 5 credentials. So we have mild to moderate support needs, we have extensive support needs, we have visual impairment, deaf and hard of hearing, and early childhood special education. So 5 credentials. Now, at that 2018 meeting in February, so the proposal was brought forward the year before, and at this meeting in 2018, you did determine that every teacher candidate should take and pass a TPA prior to earning a preliminary teaching credential. Right? So then we come to June of 2018, and at that time, you reviewed the proposed standards and teaching performance expectations, as well as the proposed subject matter requirements. And then you acted to do the following. So you affirmed the current subject matter requirements for all education specialist credentials, with the determination that preliminary multiple subject credential or preliminary single subject credential had to be pursued in one of the following content areas: English, math, social science, science, art, music, or world languages. So there's some constraint on the single subject focus for our ed specialists. And then you moved on and adopted the TPEs for early childhood special ed, deaf and hard of hearing, and visual impairments. At that same meeting, you affirmed that the early childhood special ed teaching credential would authorize teaching and services for birth through kindergarten once the regulatory process had been completed. That's underway. And then as we move forward to August of 2018, at that meeting, you adopted the program standards and the TPEs for ed specialists, mild to moderate, and extensive support need candidates. In April of 2019, you adopted authorization statements for the 5 credentials. So lots of work and deliberation and discussion. And now I'm going to turn it to my colleague, James, and he's going to take you through the universal TPEs as the common trunk for preparation.
Good afternoon, commissioners. I have to say I remember what it's like on the COA being in your chair and the people who would present. So now the roles have reversed. So I get to present to you. So thank you. And I'm very excited with the work that I'm doing. So I'm going to lead the commission through the understanding of the universal teaching performance expectations in relation to what Executive Director Mary Sandy shared with us about all of the work that has been going on for the past 50 years. There's been a lot of attention with looking at the education specialist credential along with the general education and an understanding of a universal TPE structure. That structure, it can be found in Appendix B in the agenda item, but it's looking at the development of a common or universal set of teaching performance expectations that are met by both the general ed and the education specialist teachers. And it's with the understanding that all teachers are teachers of all students, and that all students are general education students first, and that all students need intervention at different points in their academic career. Continuing on, in looking at the Commission's goal, it was that all teachers learn the fundamentals of teaching, ideally in common coursework that allows for collaboration across all credential types, and then specialize in the content of their particular credential area of emphasis. To reiterate Amy's point, those 5 areas being mild, moderate support needs, extensive support needs, deaf and hard of hearing, visual impairments, and early childhood special education. The development of a SPED or Education Specialist TPA, Teaching Performance Assessment, will occur against the same backdrop of these significant changes in the framing of teacher preparation across all range of credentials. In work that we've done with focus groups and conversations from around the states with the field, we have found that using the general education TPA as a foundation and springboard could strengthen this preparation for all teachers in the universal teaching performance expectations. And if the approach does have merit, then our question is to look at how we can augment the general education TPA to capture those specific aspects of the education specialist credentials in those 5 areas of credential emphasis. So what commission staff did is to hold multiple meetings across the state in both technology and face-to-face formats, and staff holding discussion with educator preparation programs that currently use the CalTPA or the EdTPA in their preliminary programs for education specialist credentials. And in doing that, trying to gather information about what's working well, what are challenges with this, and what programs can learn from looking at the process to fulfill the requirements of the TPA and pass. Some education specialists that do use the EdTPA with their gen ed candidates have asked that their special ed candidates take and pass that particular assessment. In order for staff to gain more information, there will be in the next series of months conversations with the EdTPA sponsor, which is the Stanford Center for Assessment, Learning, and Equity, or SCALE, in the coming weeks to learn more about how that process works. Now I'm going to turn it back over to Amy, and she's going to break down the information that was you always have to talk in the mic, part of that information that actually came out of the focus groups.
Sorry.
That's okay.
All right, so we wanted to have this opportunity to share with you all of the really amazing and wonderful feedback that we received from all of these focus group discussions. So as I said, starting in the fall and all the way up into December, we were able to talk with our stakeholders and talk with many of them, so lots of interest. And in addition, we were able to talk with our technical contractor evaluation systems group of Pearson, who will be coming along with us as we move through this development process. So we were able to hold 8 meetings in person and 3 additional meetings that were then held online. And we were able to talk with over 100 educators during this process in person. And then when we offered our 2 online opportunities to really help include teachers and others that might not have been able to travel or be at these in-person days for all all the reasons that teachers really should not leave their classrooms, right? We wanted to really make sure, though, that their voices were included. So we offered the opportunity to talk online, and that gave us another opportunity to talk with over another 200 people. So we were able to really reach out and gather that information. Then, in addition, we held an online conversation with our VI stakeholders in educator prep programs, and then a second actually in-person DHH-only meeting with the 5 DHH-approved programs in California. All of the meetings and conversations, the focus groups, followed the same kind of outline and process. We had 4 particular questions that we put forward. So we would start each focus group meeting by explaining the current redeveloped CalTPA and what that entailed and what the TPEs were looking at. And remember, we have 2 cycles of instruction in the models, in the Commission's model-sponsored CalTPA. The first one looking at how we learn about our students and plan instruction. And then our second cycle, cycle 2, which is directly focused on assessment and how assessment drives instructional decision-making. So we had 4 particular questions. The first one was, what aspects of the current CalTPA for cycle 1 or 2 would work, do you think, with your education specialist candidates? So looking at that structure, how would that perhaps, how do you think that would work? And then we moved on and said, okay, well, if these are the kinds of things you think might work, what do you think would be challenging in cycles 1 and 2? And then our third question was not here that you believe should be here and should be measured given the universal TPEs and then the specialized TPEs? And then finally, given your instructional settings and the influence those settings obviously have on teaching and teaching decisions and support of students and those communities, how do you think, we might need to support our specialist candidates in engaging in performance assessment? So they were very rich, robust conversations. There's a full analysis for you in the back in the appendix, but we did want to touch on some of the key themes and patterns that started to emerge from these conversations and across these 5 particular types of credential specialty areas. So the first thing we wanted to share with you is that really in every conversation we were able to have, there was really a sense of support and eagerness to get this work started, that there was a sense that a performance assessment would be a very valuable tool to have in the world of special education and that we should get on with launching the work. So that was a wonderful thing to hear, given that we are moving in this direction. The second thing that sort of came out of these conversations was that there was a sense that cycle 1 and 2 and the structure could serve as a foundation for the next steps that the design team that later James will talk about with you that we will be convening will help us think through all of these particular issues tied to setting, tied to candidates, and the needs of the students that we're serving in these 5 credentials. So there was this sense that the current structure might be helpful to start from. In particular, groups were encouraged to discuss those elements and I'll get to those in a second. And we did talk through and really, we shared both of the assessment guides with them, for example, looked at all the rubrics with them, talked through the TPEs that we were measuring. And then we asked them also to give us some feedback on what they would particularly like the design team members, once they were convened, to keep in mind as we moved through this development process. So all of that information, as I said, in much more detail is provided for you in Appendix D, and I would recommend taking a look at that because there really is a lot of rich information there, and we will use that information when we begin our work with the design team in February. So again, coming back to some other things that kind of emerged, some overarching themes. So again, there was a sense, most that we talked to thought that demonstrating the universal TPEs was appropriate in a performance assessment. And there was some discussion about structure and that if we were to develop, let's say, a 3rd cycle, right, we're just throwing ideas out in these focus group meetings, so some conversation was around a 3rd cycle, that if a 3rd cycle was developed, that it should focus on perhaps that process of the individual educational program, the IEP plan that is created for an identified student as they move through that process. And the other real area of focus that came up, no matter what type of special educator we were talking with, was the importance of collaboration. And the work of an ed specialist and is so involved with collaborating with other adults, having paras in the classroom, et cetera, that we could think about how are we making sure that our preliminary candidates are developing the skill set to work with other educators as they do their work as a special educator. Particularly the early childhood special education group that we had several that we were able to talk with, shared that certainly adjustments would have to be made to the current versions of the 2 cycles, given particularly the age range of their students, because in that credential specialization area, those educators are credentialed to work with children birth through kindergarten. So if you think of very young children, you think about a TPA, then we have to think carefully about all of the ramifications that come with that. And the settings, right? So they have a very broad set of settings that they work in. We talked with our DHH colleagues and faculty, and they expressed a lot of interest in the potential of perhaps starting with some local scoring options to really, they strongly encourage us to really think about that and what that might look like in a statewide expectation for performance assessment. And then the visually impaired faculty that we talked with also talked a lot about the modifications and, again, their specialized settings. The fact that many VI faculty are itinerant and are not necessarily in one space all the time, but, very much moving from setting to support their students depending on their needs. So those were some of the things that really came to the surface. And then particularly to our 4 questions, we wanted to share some of that feedback with you. So I'll take the first 2 questions. I'll turn it to James for the second 2. So our first question focused on, given the current cycles that are looking at the universal TPEs as they are, what might be applicable for education specialist candidates. So there was a sense in our conversations across those 8 in-person and online conversations that whole notion of having a metacognitive cycle of plan, teach and assess, reflect, and apply, that felt comfortable, that is what they believed their candidates should be moving through that metacognitive process. The second thing was that they really did embrace and also wanted to encourage us to continue to think about asking candidates to demonstrate practice in a range of ways. So having a full range of required evidence, whether it's a written narrative or it's a video of performance. And of course, we have a lot to share with you about their concerns around video, but lesson plans, again, all of the artifacts that might come on the natural out of a classroom teaching situation, like to make sure that we really were using a broad range of evidence to be able to allow a candidate to document and demonstrate their proficiency. So they were happy with that because that is currently what we do in our 2 cycles. The other thing that they were all very much in support of was this notion of developing reflective practitioners. So that third step in our cycle of plan, teach, assess, reflect on your practice, reflect. They really felt that concept, that philosophy ought to be a strong part of any performance assessment that we develop, and that we should look to see that these practitioners are reflective. They thought analytic rubrics, as they're currently developed, could be very helpful, and then that working with an English learner was important to keep in the discussion and in the work with the design team. Finally, there was some talk about content and how do we think about content for an ed specialist who often will teach a range of content areas, and what would be the thinking around what we would ask a candidate to demonstrate. So that came up, and pretty much folks were comfortable with the concept of if maybe we should do math and literacy as we do for our elementary teachers, but then if you are single subject and you can have a single subject CSET coming into special ed, then maybe that should be okay too. So again, asking for flexibility and staying open around thinking about content and really working with the design team to talk about what content really looks like with all of our ed specialists. So those things all came up. Then we got to our second, so all those things they thought, yes, there should be content. Yes, we should work with an EL learner perhaps. Yes, plan, teach, reflect, apply seems to make sense. And yes, reflective practitioners. All that could work in some way. Now we got to challenges. So what were things maybe that they thought in the current system might not work, and what should we maybe go back to thinking more carefully about given the setting and the students? So they wanted to make sure that we really kept in mind that sometimes our ed specialists will work with a student, a few students, or perhaps the whole group of students, or perhaps a whole class of students, and so to stay flexible there. And what would that be a challenge? How would we allow for that flexibility? There was a lot of discussion about video of practice. Most, I would say, agreed that it was very important and a good methodology, and it really can help you change your practice. But of course, lots of concerns about how do we protect the student, other adults that might be in the video, how do you collect those permissions? So lots of conversation there. And in some cases, maybe it's just flat out not appropriate, right? So we need to think about that. And then the notion of focus students, I thought that was okay, but not necessarily how they currently are, which is English learner, a child on an IEP 504, gifted and talented, and then a child who's experienced some kind of trauma in or outside of school. But in their context, maybe those three could be slightly reconceptualized or different, or, could we think about that might be challenging. Specific pedagogy, again, they felt like there was special education knowledge, skills, and abilities that they would like to see in the performance assessment beyond what's currently there. And then they wanted us to make sure that we encourage the design team to consider how much of the assessment would focus on the common trunk versus the specifics, so that balance, what would that look like? How would the design team advise us on that? As we talked to our lower incidence groups, DHH, VI, and the early childhood special education, they again over and over talked about the specificity of their settings, the specialized context in which they work, and thinking about pedagogy because they have that broader age range from birth to 22. And what does that mean and how does that look? And then finally, DHH and VI faculty again brought forward the idea for consideration of the notion of having a locally administered, perhaps and scored assessment. Was there a way for that to work in a statewide expectation for performance assessment? So those are our first two questions and some of our findings, and we're going to go on and share some more. You can have.
So in drawing your attention to questions 3 and 4, question 3, as you can see, asked, what do you not see in the current TPA that you might want to see in the education specialist TPA, and what the candidates should have in terms of their assessment? The areas that were identified were creating IEP goals, tying it to the individual education plan for students, and also facilitating an IEP meeting. Collaborating with other educators, such as support staff, was also strongly emphasized, working with paraprofessionals, counselors, occupational therapists, aides, administrators, counselors, and language therapists, and in particular also parents. And this was very, I'm going to draw out just for a moment in terms of early childhood special education, because in that setting oftentimes when you're working with the early childhood, especially at birth, you're almost working with the parent more than with the child to help parents understand how they work with the varied needs of an infant. And so they felt that that was something that really needed to be looked at because that's a very pivotal part of their work. Also looking at, going back to facilitated IEPs, what students' role is in a led IEP, as many districts and other areas are going to that model. Looking at life skills in addition to academic content, again, something that we're seeing at district levels where it's content tied to life skills that students need in order to be successful outside of school. And finally, looking at matriculation plans, especially when children go from elementary to middle to high, and also transition plans once children leave high school and enter into the workforce and still are monitored through different types of transition centers as they're aged up to 22. And so finally, the last question that we asked was, how does that setting of instruction influence or impact how the education specialist candidate engages and completes a CalTPA? And really taking into consideration, and Amy's already mentioned, the flexibility in looking at the settings, whether it is home, hospitals, a traditional classroom setting, and what different areas can have in terms of looking at how a candidate might be assessed against both the universal and program-specific TPEs, and what that could look like in terms of demonstrating those important pedagogical skills with a diverse group of students and looking at their assets and their learning needs to help enhance instruction. So from those questions, it launched us into our work with talking specifically to programs that use the CalTPA for a requirement with their education specialist candidates. So evaluation systems and commission staff, again, evaluation systems as our technical contractor, we all had a meeting in which we looked at how the CalTPA is used for their programs and what are some of the benefits, challenges, and unique ideas with this particular assessment. And what we found was that the authenticity of the education specialist work for candidates is inherent in the CalTPA, as Amy referred to. The plan, teach, reflect, and apply cycle is a universal idea for all candidates. They also found that the CalTPA encourages a great deal of collaboration with general education teachers. They felt that there needed to be, especially with the focused student selection, that it really pushed them to work with general education teachers as well as other support staff to help know how they can support the needs of the students with whom they're working. And as a result, education specialist candidates commented to their programs that they have a deeper learning of their students' needs by understanding the general education content and their work in supporting them through that process. And according to the faculty on the call, we found that the rubrics that they use, they did feel that they do accurately reflect the skills and assets necessary for that preliminary education specialist credential, and that the rubrics did in fact capture teaching behaviors for both the ed specialist and the general education candidates. A challenge was really looking at the placement. There could be challenges with placements with the education specialist candidate based on those range of settings of how different ideas are captured. As Amy referenced, videotaping could be a challenge, and looking at working with parents and other adults, and that they needed to really look at structures that are in place in classrooms and also in other alternative settings. The programs did share excitement with the requirement in Cycle 1 to select focus students, and so we had a rich conversation about what that could look like. There was definitely consensus around sticking with the English learner aspect of Focus Student 1, looking at possibly a unique need with social or emotional for another focus student. And really they also looked at the idea of looking at another student who possibly could have someone with an autism spectrum disorder and what that would look like in terms of providing services, because in many cases that's almost a secondary learning challenge that a student may have. They may be identified in one, but they may also have subsequent secondary learning needs. And the other piece that was important was to examine students from that culturally responsive pedagogical lens, looking at what they bring into the classroom so that we capture that home students' culture into that funds of knowledge that we have in the Gen Ed TPA in a way to promote capacity for all students. So as we had these conversations, we learned a great deal, and then it launched us into the timeline and process for the design team. The application was delivered in the fall of 2019. We received more than 100 applications. Actually, the exact number was 117 applications from around the state. And when candidates were selected for the design team, pieces that were important were looking at their credential area of emphasis, ensuring that we had 5 credential areas of emphasis represented, looking at the balance of programs, looking at IHEs, LEAs, other alternative ways of providing certification, looking at the balance of geographic regions, making sure that we had equal representation from all parts of the state, and also looking at what previous work these design team members had with current commission structures, such as the Board of Institutional Review, task groups, site visits, or other types of accreditation work. The design team was appointed by the executive director in December, and we have built together our current design team, which consists of 21 members, and that's in Appendix C. However, I do want to add that we do have one additional member from the DHH group who has turned in application materials and then will be subject to review by the executive director for appointment to the design team. So that process is our last step in securing a whole team. So then as we look at our upcoming calendar, we have in 2020 to develop and draft the assessment cycles, which include the actual tasks and rubrics. 2020 to 2021 will be pilot testing, refining those cycles with input from the field. Then as we go into 21-22, looking at the field test cycles, and again with input from the field, refining as necessary. Completing our standard setting study in the spring of 2022, and finally looking at a fall 2022-23 operational administration of the Special Education CalTPA. So as we are moving forward and bringing this item to you, we were looking at different phases of the way that we could possibly ease into this work, looking at phase 1, beginning in early 2020 to focus on the mild, moderate support needs and extensive support needs credentials. Phase 2 could begin later with that focus on the deaf and hard of hearing, visual impairments, and early childhood special education. And also in reference back to Dr. Sandy's point earlier today, looking at that master plan for early childhood education that is currently under development and expected to be released by the end of 2020 to inform that work with the early childhood special education. So given that timeline around that broader statewide effort on early childhood, work in this area would not begin before the winter or spring of 2022 once we see what steps and ideas are coming forth with that. And so with this, as we move forward with the design team, we see that it is very clear that the needs of our students and the candidates in looking at their instructional content must always be thoughtfully considered and carefully managed, and bringing everyone together to look at what that performance assessment could shape to be. So I'm going to now turn it back to Amy to have you speak to the considerations for the design team.
Yeah. So we're looking forward to this opportunity to talk with you today, and we have 4 things we would like you to consider based on what we found from the focus groups, our online and in-person conversations, our outreach to the programs that are already actually having their ed specialists use the TPA, the CalTPA just as it is, and what they're finding, and then of course our process we've gone through to pull together the design team to help really drive the development of these assessments. So there are 4 particular things. So we would like you to think about and consider the current Commission's CalTPA as a foundation for the development, particularly for candidates who seek to earn both a general education and a special education credential. And to consider the goal of strengthening common preparation and assessment given the universal TPEs. So we have a complex set of design challenges ahead of us, but in addition, we have candidates, remember, who are pursuing a general ed credential simultaneously with a special ed credential. And the question is, from our stakeholders, how will you navigate that? How will that happen for our candidates? How will we not exhaust them and wear them out to the point of them deciding this is just, not for them? So we have been talking a lot about that. So that's something we'd like to consider with you. And could the current foundation help us move forward, and how will we think about general ed and special ed candidates who are simultaneously looking at those credentials? And then we'd like you to consider, to the extent that the general ed TPA is the foundation, so let's just imagine that that's what is the outcome from today, then how would we best adapt it? Do you have any thoughts you would like to share with us about that? The third thing to consider would be if we do develop, so we have cycle 1 that looks at instructional design and learning about your students. We have cycle 2 that looks at assessment and how that drives instruction. Were we to move forward and the design team were to, just determine that it would be appropriate, that we developed a third cycle, perhaps one specific cycle for each of the 5, what would that look like? And so considering the development of a third cycle to augment the approved gen ed performance assessments. And remember, we have 3 types of performance assessments that are approved for use. So we have the commission's model, the CalTPA. We have the Ed TPA. James spoke a little bit about that. And then we also have our program in Fresno, FAST, that's only for Fresno. So given those existing models, let's say we were to develop a third cycle, how would all of this fit together? And be supportive of candidate development. And potentially options could include a focus on the specialty content area TPEs and working with other educators or on that data class. So again, just coming back to this concept, if we were to develop a third cycle, what of those specialized TPEs would be most appropriate for that preliminary ed specialist candidate? Is it understanding the IEP process and how that's conducted to meet the needs of a student? Is it working with other educators? Like, what would the focus of measurement be? Would it be both of them woven together? I mean, right? So that was one thing we would like you to consider. And then finally, the notion of flexibility. How can we build inside of a structure an assessment that can be valid and reliable, but still allow for flexibility so that setting can be a vast range of settings, so that age group could be et cetera. So we'd like you to think about that. We also have candidates, for example, that we need to think about that already have a general ed credential and want to add a special ed credential. So what would we need to recommend for them to do? If they had already taken a TPA for their multiple subject or single subject credential, would they then, in their SPED program, then just take that 1/3 specialized credential? Could it go in the opposite direction? If they started as a SPED candidate, then could that be... See what I'm saying? Lots of things to think about. So we would like you to consider these 4 sets of issues, design really issues, with us and give us some guidance. And so that's like that. For that is all around the first part of this commission item. In addition to those 4 important considerations that we're really looking forward to your feedback on, we also need to bring to your attention that the current assessment design standards need to have a little bit of modification to think about and to be able to allow us to be flexible in the design of these new assessments. So if I may bring you to that, so if we could put that on this part of our mind and now come and focus on the assessment design standards. We have 3 assessment design standards, and it is only in the first assessment design standard that looks at validity and fairness that we are recommending to you as staff that we might need to modify the language a bit. And that is in your item. And so the first part of this set of validity and fairness expectations for assessment design, the one that we are putting in front of you for you to determine whether or not you would adopt, is 1E. And 1E says this: for multiple subject candidates, the model sponsor must include assessments of the core content areas of at least literacy and math. So in our commission's model, cycle 1 must be literacy and cycle 2 must be math, or cycle 1 must be math and cycle 2 must be literacy if you are a multiple subject candidate. And then we were following the assessment design standards when that came to bear, given that design team. But in this case, we're recommending that we add a little bit language, and it's in bold for you. So here's what we propose that you consider adding. For education specialist candidates, the model, so we would keep what I already read, but we would add this. For education specialist candidates, the model sponsor must include assessments that allow for either multiple subject, literacy and math, or single subject, content, as deemed appropriate for special education. So that takes us back to that list. That's a little, that we talked about earlier in the item, and that this would align with the student teaching and or clinical placement that the candidate is in. Okay, so that's our first recommendation, that we allow for some flexibility there. It's either literacy and math, perhaps, or maybe it is your single subject area, but it might have to be tied to where you're actually doing your practice, right? That would make sense. If you're doing your ed specialist placement in an elementary setting, then perhaps we need literacy and math. But if you're doing your placement in a high school setting and you're working in the science classroom and you did a CSET in science, then maybe you should be doing these in science. And we would like, I think, what we've heard from everyone, the appeal was try and be flexible here, because they have that full range of placement opportunity. So,
and to add to that, in the high school, for example, you can have a self-contained classroom for students with emotional needs, and you have a teacher that has all subject areas because it has been determined that that is the most appropriate placement for that student. Or in other settings where the student is in such a high-risk area that it's a smaller program, but again, they are teaching all subjects because with regard to the emotional needs of the students or the specific learning or cognitive areas that the students need assistance with. So a lot of times in the secondary, that's what that might look like.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Mm-hmm. So that's 1E, kind of, approaching and opening up and broadening our understanding of content in regard to performance assessment for our education specialists. That brings us to 1F. And 1F speaks to how the model sponsor must include a focus on classroom teaching performance within the TPA, including a video of the candidate's classroom teaching performance with candidate commentary describing the lesson plan and rationale for teaching decisions shown and evidence of the effect of that teaching on student learning. So currently, in the current TPA model, multiple times candidates are asked to submit videos. They go into those videos and annotate them for particular pedagogical practices that they're highlighting. So in this case, given the full range of discussions we've been having and the considerations of keeping students safe and teachers safe, we wanted to recommend to you to consider adding this language, that for specialized settings, video recording of teaching practice may be a choice among several options for providing evidence of the effect that teaching has on student learning. So that when there are these cases where it's not appropriate, that would not keep a candidate from doing their clinical work in that setting, and they wouldn't be kept from doing their TPA in that setting. So those are the two areas. We felt that the other two parts of our assessment design standards that guide all performance assessment for everyone who wants to design a performance assessment in California, the second two areas of reliability and fairness, and then our third around model sponsor support responsibilities, that those were fine as currently written and could still be implemented in these settings and across these types of, these 5 particular credentials. Okay, so here we are, staff recommendations. We have 2 things that we're recommending to you. We recommend that you review, discuss, and if appropriate, provide staff direction regarding the plan for development of the SPED TPA, perhaps with an S, the feedback from the focus groups, and the considerations identified in the item. So all that we kind of did in the first 3/4 of this presentation. Our second recommendation is that you adopt the minor revisions to the assessment design standards 1E and 1F as shown in the item. And then James will speak about next steps.
And finally, our next steps would be that staff will begin the work with the design team using the guidance that is provided by the Commission, and that we will continue to update the Commission on the special education performance assessment development efforts to you as necessary.
We're done.
Thank you. That was very thorough. Okay, so we'll open up for public comment, and we will start with Ivania Soto, please.
Good afternoon. Thank you we're pleased that English learners were a part of this discussion. I'm supposed to say my, affiliation. Okay, Ivania with CABE, the California Association for Bilingual Education. It's been a couple months. And I'm also a professor at Whittier College. So we're pleased, again, that English learners were a part of the conversation. We wonder, since there is often an over-identification of English learners with special needs, if candidates should have practice with determining language needs versus disability, perhaps in cycle 3. Under 3B, we also think that collaboration can also include collaboration with an ELL coordinator on site and or the designated ELD teacher who can assist with language needs, right, and creating language objectives connected to the ELD standards specifically. And lastly, might it be possible to have an ELL expert on the design team to kind of, so that we're not working in silos and so that these two high needs group of students are, their needs are met. Thank you.
Thank you. Danette Brown?
Good afternoon, Danette Brown, representing the California Teachers Association. Happy anniversary! The California Teachers Association, we were very fortunate that last weekend we had our State Council of Education meeting. And so our special ed committee was able to really was able to really review this item and give us some feedback. So I wanted to share with you some of the thoughts. First of all, we really appreciate the time and effort that went into the CTC having the focus groups at the front end of this process to really inform the process and craft a plan from here on out. So thanks. We really also think the phasing of the development of the TPAs is a very smart thing to do. It's an effective use of resources, and I think we'll learn a lot as we move forward. We also, CTA supports the second recommendation of the adoption of the minor revisions to the assessment design standards 1E and 1F as described on page 2F-8. Yay! Okay, so now here's some different kind of feedback. There were a few things in the agenda item that really caused us pause. So we just wanted to bring that to the table. So we appreciate the notion that the current TPA may be a springboard to then further develop the Ed Specialist TPA. However, on page 2 of the item, where it states, the role of the education specialist includes teaching, but focuses specifically on assessing student learning needs, developing individual education plans, collaborating with other adults that provide instruction and other supports for learning, and managing student caseload. Our members have some concerns over the notion of including teaching, and that language really seems to diminish the teaching part. So if that's how we're framing the role of the ed specialist, we would really encourage more conversations with employers and practitioners who may have a different understanding of the role of the ed specialist. So on that same note, if that is how we're framing the role of the ed specialist, then if their role is where teaching is not their primary function, but these other things are, we're concerned how much of those first 2 cycles of a TPA that are focused for general educators who their primary role might be teaching. So I guess how much can you adapt those before it's not what you're starting out with? So just something to think about, kind of figuring out what the role is before we start messing around with the TPAs. The second main concern we have is that this agenda item suggests that ed specialists may take cycle 1 and cycle 2 and then take an additional cycle 3 that focuses on those other things that may be their primary role. We think this might be a great option to explore for those candidates who are pursuing dual credentialing. They're getting their general ed and their special ed at the same time. Also, we would like to know what percentage of candidates that might be, because I know we hear a lot about those programs, but we're not quite clear on how many that is now. So what we would be adamantly opposed to for candidates that choose just pursuing the ed specialist credential to have to do cycle 1, cycle 2, and cycle 3, because we believe that would put an additional burden on those candidates and it has the potential to exacerbate the shortage. We would not be in support of anything that causes more work, more time, or more expense to someone just pursuing the ed specialist credential. So we want to be mindful that the choices we make don't exacerbate the problem we're trying to solve. So we look forward to the design team getting together and grappling with some of these issues, and I'll see you soon. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Danette. And our last speaker on this item is Rigel Mazzaro.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. Rigel Spencer-Massaro with Public Advocates. I'm going to pass out in just a moment. My colleagues at the Education Trust West gave me a beautiful handout on teachers of color to circulate to you, which I will relate to my comments. I really appreciate the focus groups. I do wonder, and my comments are somewhat narrow, so forgive me. I think overall this process is really promising, and we're excited to watch its rollout. We wonder if the Commission has had an opportunity to consult with any special education advocates or parent groups. Parents of students with disabilities are among the most, and as a former teacher and former attorney representing them, I would say the most involved parents. They understand their children at a level not always communicated in an IEP. They are informed by often multiple evaluations over years, and they have experience with different educator styles and the daily understanding of their children. They are critical educational partners, and a strong educational specialist TPA would assess, I think, candidates' ability to prioritize parent partnerships. I'd like to lift up the program feedback that the TPA assess how candidates are, quote, to examine students from a culturally responsive pedagogical lens to allow candidates the opportunity to incorporate aspects of a student's home culture into the classroom and to build upon these funds of knowledge for the general education teacher as well as promoting capacity for the student. That's a lot, and it's good stuff. And while this examination is critical for all students, it is particularly critical for students with disabilities whose parents are these strong partners in their educational success. It is also worth noting that parents of students with disabilities are disproportionately African American and immigrant, as African American and English learner students are overrepresented in special education. Hence, home culture can differ significantly from a teacher candidate's culture. I can just pass these around. There are more at the rear of the room for any members of the audience interested in seeing ETW's research on teacher diversity in California. Also wanted to lift up the feedback that the current CalTPA, and again, pulling this from the item, does not sufficiently address the education specialist's role in collaborating with the student's educational community. Parents are the third example listed, and we would elevate their role beyond an example. The Education Code, which was strengthened last year by SB 695, states that LEAs shall take any action necessary to ensure parents understand and can participate in the IEP process, and teachers are the front lines of that understanding, and not just during the IEP process, but the whole year long when it's being implemented. So really consider parent partnership as a guiding principle to the development of the Ed Specialist CalTPA. And finally, while, as you can tell, I'm all for robust and comprehensive assessment of all teachers, given the seemingly eternal and currently unconscionable shortage of credentialed special education teachers, I want to caution against the creation of a CalTPA that is seen as especially burdensome or costly to these candidates. Thank you.
Okay, so that closes public comment on this item. Commissioners, would you like to comment? Yes, Commissioner Hyde.
I really appreciate the comments of our speakers. just really nice to get a clear understanding of what's in the field and what's happening with people who are experiencing this. One of the thoughts that I was having during the presentation is, is there really a need for a third cycle? Because in cycle 1 and cycle 2, cycle 1, getting to know your students, doesn't matter which population of students you're working with, you should be able to get to know your students no matter what you're teaching. And then cycle 2, when you're doing your teaching and you're videotaping and you're reflecting on your teaching, again, it shouldn't matter what your population is. And even in the CalTPA that we have right now, it does ask you to pull out EL students, special needs students, and I can't remember the third category, but I know there's specific categories you have to have student 1, 2, and 3. Right. So there is call for that. So if you're getting a ed specialist credential, you're already doing your work in a classroom with students with the high need area. I don't think that we should make it more difficult by having them identify the exact area of special need that they plan to work with in the future. It's very narrowing for the educator and for the student population that they'll be working with, and you don't always have enough of a population in a school site to be able to get a really good understanding of a specific population of learners. So I think what we could do is just use the TPA that we already have and not try to recreate the wheel, and just make sure that when you're going through the process and you're teacher candidate, that you are getting the experience for the population of learners that your credential reflects that you have knowledge of and mastery. And so I don't think that we need a third cycle. I know it's so much extra work. I was just talking with a student candidate the other day who said that a third of her cohort had already turned in their first cycle and failed. A whole third of their cohort. And this is at UCSC. I mean, that shouldn't be happening. So it is happening. The struggle is real for them. It's very difficult, and they're young, and they don't, exactly know how to continually be redundant. And the TPA is redundant. There's a lot that you have to repeat and repeat again and explain further. And when you are going through it for your first time, you don't really know. So I don't think adding a third cycle is going to make it better for anybody. And we do need those teachers in special ed. We need them in the classroom, just like we need our general ed teachers as well. And so I think if we could just take what we have and really take the time to teach our candidates what it is that we're looking for and what they need to be able to know and do by the time they turn in their TPA and pass their TPA, then I think we'll be successful.
Thank you. Yes, Commissioner Greneau-Shire?
So I had a couple of thoughts. The first was, be careful what you ask for in design. As I was hearing the complexity of this work, I'm recalling conversations a couple of years ago as we thought about what this might be, and it is very complex. Secondly, I can't think of anybody better than that woman right there to lead this work. I'm sorry, James, I don't know you as well, but I'm sure you're a good partner. But just your deep understanding of performance assessment is really going to help this process. So there, as my other higher ed colleagues do, we consult with our colleagues prior to coming to these meetings, and there was a lot of confusion, at least among the CSU education deans, about whether we were talking about a new TPA or the existing TPA, and your presentation and walking through the agenda item, I think, really helped to clarify that. So I just want to confirm that it's one TPA. We may or may not add a third cycle to address some of the particular feedback related to certain teaching performance expectations. And so I would encourage the staff to be really clear in their communications about that, because at least in the CSU there's some confusion about that. I was intrigued with Commissioner Hines' idea that we don't need a third cycle, and I would like to spend some more time, because I began, as I was listening, thinking we absolutely do need, for all the additional content that an ed specialist candidate may have to demonstrate, but perhaps there is a way within the two existing cycles that we don't have to have a third, and that would go a long way to what the field is saying in terms of be careful we don't add additional barriers that it's going to exacerbate the teacher shortage. And then finally, I want to make sure whatever we do encourages the development of more inclusive teacher preparation programs. So to the point that was raised about what percentage, still a very small percentage of our programs are truly dual credential programs. But when faculty and administrators began developing those programs, we assured them that we weren't going to give them more work to do that was going to prevent people from wanting to do these two credentials. So just some thoughts as we move forward.
Commissioner Hind?
Just really quickly, I wanted to, you just made me think, Marquita, when you were saying that about the third cycle, I think what would be really helpful, maybe it's just the way that I process things, would be to take what you would expect from a general ed teacher, TPA, to look like, and what would you expect to see if you had an ed specialist, TPA, what would that look like? As far as activities you were looking for in the classroom, things you were looking for in the videos, and actually have the design team or whatever team, write it up as if they were taking the test themselves, but as a group, a collective group of I guess you do it when you're making your rubrics, but the rubrics in themselves are a little bit vague too. So it says, this candidate is above and beyond. Well, above and beyond what? I want to see exactly, at this point in your video, here's what I saw in the general ed classroom, and that was exactly what I was looking for. And in the video for the special ed teacher, here's what I was looking for, and that really showed blank. And then also, I just lost it. There was another piece that went along that same line of just kind of what does that look like? And then we actually don't want to micromanage either all the skills that each person should know and be able to do, because half of what you learn in the first 5 years that you're there, hopefully you stay. So I don't want to get into the micromanaging point of, well, if you have this credential, then you must be able to do this at this point. So just to keep that in mind.
Commissioner Francois?
I want to echo what an amazing job you all do with these CalTPAs, and the design of the CalTPA is really beautifully done. And I think a testament to that is that we're even having a conversation about it being able to be used to help us to assess education specialist candidates. And I have to say that I'm really torn about this third cycle, because I do understand the additional burden a third cycle would put on a candidate in terms of time, expense. We haven't talked about whether it would cost more money, and if they fail, do they have to pay again? I'm thinking about the concern about exacerbating a teacher shortage if there's a third cycle. And it brings me back to what I said earlier around not chasing the shortage, chasing the qualified candidate for the shortage. And I wonder if not having a third cycle says that there's not particular expertise that teachers need for one of the most vulnerable student populations that we have, that historically has not been served well through general education or any other attempts at the early attempts of mainstreaming, co-teaching, inclusion, all of that. And so this is an opportunity for us to do things a little bit differently. And I don't have an answer, but I want us to be careful not to go back to it being about the shortage. It's about preparing highly qualified teachers for these different vulnerable student populations. And as our last speaker said, we already know that there are particular populations that are overrepresented in special education, and it's because they have an accumulation of needs. And when one of those needs is special ed, I do think we have to do more. We don't do the same. I worry about adding to the current CalTPA and asking all candidates to dig deeper into special education, because they are getting a general ed credential. So I'm not convinced that it's okay for us not to expect more from candidates who are committing to serving our most vulnerable candidates. And the kind of a minor thing that I wanted to mention is that we oftentimes just think about English learners as English learners, and I don't want us to forget that we have standard English learners who that is often invisible, primarily because, and I'm going to say it, they're Black students, and I want to make sure that they stay on the radar.
Commissioner Marks and Commissioner Wall?
Well, I don't want to make an overly simplistic statement, but I feel like I'm a general education teacher, but I'm also a special ed teacher. I mean, there's no general ed teacher in the state who's not a special ed teacher right now. And so I really am very interested in looking more at not providing a third cycle. I feel like if we do our due diligence, we could make those first two cycles rich and inclusive, and then we won't. Then it also looks at the
appropriate for me to add something to the conversation. So we didn't mean to confuse by saying that we thought we would have someone pursuing a single credential would engage in 3 cycles. We heard loud and clear that 2 is enough. And the concept is more about, is there a way to have sort of a menu of choices for candidates? So if you're in a dual program and you're pursuing multiple subjects, you might do 2 multiple subject in a multiple subject setting. And then if you also want that SPED credential, right? Because most of the programs I talk to that are doing that, their programs are 18 months to 2 years of time. There's more time, hopefully, right? You're pursuing 2 credentials. You need more time to learn how to be a teacher across that broad array of expectations. And so it would be, in that case, that maybe then you would add a third because you're adding, because you are in fact simultaneously, you have self-chosen to do 2 credentials. So that was kind of the thing. It was kind of like, is there a way for us to get to the specialness and the pedagogy that comes for mild, moderate, that comes with extensive needs, that comes with DHH, that comes with VI? And do those live in their own cycle? And then we have our other 2. But then candidates mixed and matched depending on the number of credentials they were pursuing and where they're doing their clinical practice. So it's complicated. So I just wanted to suggest that we weren't trying to say 3. We heard loud and clear. Everyone agrees like 2 is a great number. And it's a lot to, these are very complex cycles. Remember, we have 8 rubrics and 7. I mean, they get a lot of analytic feedback already in these 2 very complex cycles. So I just wanted to throw that out and reassure you that we are well aware that that might just be a little bit too much. But for the candidates trying to do them both, so your candidate who's only doing SPED first, they might do cycle 1 and the special ed 1, getting to 2. Or if you're doing, right, you can imagine how this would look. Maybe where's our whiteboard, Mary? I need to draw some pictures. So we're so early in this conversation. I think what we're trying to say to you is that we heard from our focus groups that, yes, the universal TPEs ought to be looked at. Going back to your comment, I'm a general ed teacher, but I'm a special ed teacher. But then for special educators, they have come and said to us, we have very specialized knowledge that we would like to make sure our preliminary candidates have the opportunity to learn and then therefore demonstrate. And they particularly said the notion of the individual educational plan and working with other adults. Those 2 things we don't currently measure in our 2 TPAs. So there's lots of ways to do this. We could take the recommendation and look at the 2 and just sort of gut and rebuild, or we could keep them as they are. So there's this continuity around all teachers, but then add a special. So, and Mary gave us the great news this morning that we're heading into the world of performance assessment, perhaps for early childhood, and we would be faced with the same question, like, how do we begin? So one idea that we were trying to express in the item, and maybe it wasn't clear, but it was this kind of this menu of choices. So depending on the path you're taking to get to your credentials, we could mix and match cycles for you. So it's something like a long, but it's early in its generation of an idea. So it's just kind of maybe we could do it that way. But it's up to all of you and our design team to really help us figure this out. And if you remember back to our work on the redeveloped TPA. That was 18 years in coming before we could redevelop it at this level, and even then it took us a good 3 years to pilot test, reiterate, field test, reiterate, and even now we have things that we are still making more clear and fixing. So this will be multi-years together over this design problem, and today's kind of our first entry-level conversation with you. So rest assured that nothing's locked down, I guess is what I would like to say. We're in the generation of idea phase, and we have our design team and all of our stakeholders that have come to the table and given us great ideas as well. So.
Thank you for that clarification. I think it was really helpful. I want to encourage you to further use your metaphor of the trunk and the tree.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And potentially place these on the trunk and the tree.
Like apples, maybe, or?
Honestly, because, as you were talking, it became really clear to me that you were placing the TPAs in different places in that metaphor. And it actually helped me to see, I think, where the different challenges might be and what's common and what's not, which I think is illuminating our underlying thinking about the practice in each area, right? The social practice of teaching in each area. So to me, metaphors have a powerful place in helping us understand, because I think that we're really illuminating, and I think that's the depth of the discussion, is just what is common and what is unique and where would we assess that in different places. And I would hope that we would hold as much common as we could, because of exactly what people are saying. That every teacher is a special education teacher, every teacher is a general education teacher.
I just wanted to clarify where we are in this process again, but I think, Amy, you did a very good job of that. But just to say, for commissioners, this is our opportunity to get to see the feedback that the commission got from all of the focus group work, which, by the way, was I commend I echo what Commissioner Francois said. This is just such good work that you're getting all of that feedback first to help guide the design team. But that's what we're also doing here too. We're getting feedback from all of us. Our questions, our concerns, are things that we want the design team to look at. But the design team were selected for their expertise to start digging in and developing some things to come back to us again. So we'll have multiple times, to give feedback. So that's all I just wanted to make sure we understood at this point.
Thank you, Chair. So I think that was the intent. It wasn't clear to me at the beginning. So perhaps what is emerging are design principles that we would like James and Amy to take back to the design team. I really like this idea of the apples on the tree, or the oranges, or whatever they happen to be, but those are those specialized nuggets of information. So I think you're hearing the feedback from the field and from us, and then to take that back to the team, because the design team, because you're right, those are the experts that are really going to grapple with some of these very complex issues.
This is just my favorite topic of the moment. We've had many favorite topics already today. I really am also, in as much as we know we need to differentiate so we capture the right material for candidates, this idea of a common piece that links them together. The design of a common trunk of preparation for all teachers to engage in together. It's like the beginning of your collaboration is in your preparation program if we do that right? So the idea of having a common cycle that introduces all teachers to the concept of universal designs for learning and adaptation to the students and the content that you're teaching, what a great springboard, that's a great word for it, into the areas of specialization and the ways in which you're going to specialize. So we're very excited about the design team beginning their work in a few weeks. It's just a few weeks from now that they will be here for the first time. And it's helpful, extremely helpful, both to have the focus group, backdrop of having been out tilling the soil in the field to get a sense of where things are, seem promising or have concerns, but also to get a sense of the overall policy kind of frame for this and some of the design principles that appeal to this body for the continuity of the work. So this, I think, has been really helpful for that.
Chair Sloan? This is not my area of expertise, and this is a chicken and egg, not TPA, yes, performance assessment. I spent a lot of years. I'm in special education. But I do have a question about the modification of 1F and the design team standards, where we're already saying for specialized setting, video recording may be a choice among several options. I know we need design standards so that we can allow exam sponsors to have guidelines for what they create. At the same time, I would like to see the specialist, the design team, say to us as they dig in what makes sense. So I don't really know what to do about this. But some of my colleagues who know the field better could maybe help me understand whether we need to keep this here now or whether there's another way. So my question is, would people who are in the field of special education, and it seems like many people from the focus groups were concerned about video. I also know many people in general education are concerned about the video. Mm-hmm. So not knowing the special education settings as well, my question is it necessary at this moment to say for anything in special education settings, you don't need to do video, but in general education settings you do? Is that a reasonable and important distinction to make right now before we have the design team deliberate about what the options are? So
I think that was why we used the word choice. There could be a choice. So maybe we say it needs to be video, but if it's a setting. So for example, right now with the current Gen Ed TPA with all the video expectations, there is still, if you're teaching in an alternative setting, there is a modification where you can use audio, an audio tape instead, because by law you can't video record in a incarcerated setting, for example, just one example. So I think we were just trying, because we had so much dialogue, it wasn't that I ever got the sense that our educators thought that special educators shouldn't gain from the experience of having a video recording of their practice and getting to talk about it and getting feedback. It was more about protection of the students and the families, and just some concerns. But you're right. I mean, when we started this work 20 years ago, lots of concern about video recordings. As we launched our administrative performance assessment work, lots of concern about video. Now we've always worked it out. So you bring up a very good point, and so maybe there's no need to do this. We could wait and see.
I think the video piece, and I think our student liaison can probably speak to this. Most teachers don't like to speak in front of adults. They don't like to speak, and especially be videotaped. And it's a very small group of us who are fine going out and speaking in public. That's why you have very few teachers who speak at school board meetings. There are very few teachers who are comfortable for back to school night. So when you're asking them to be recorded, to be played before a panel before that they don't know, to assess their ability to teach, it is very intimidating for most people. So I think there's part of it, that is like, it's a setting in which, we want to protect the students, whatever. But I think most people's apprehension is because they're just not comfortable in this field. It's so funny because we're so good in front of kids, and then most of us are so shy when it comes to talking in front of adults. I think that's like a big thing that we don't always think about. We think, because we're comfortable, everyone should be comfortable talking in front of adults, and that's just not the case.
And to add to that, I think the other idea that Amy is trying to express is if you look at the way that the 1F is written, it says, including a video of the candidate's classroom teaching performance. I think that what we're talking about is looking at the choice being, as was mentioned earlier in the item, sometimes the setting is not a whole classroom. It can be a small group. It can be one-on-one. And I think if we're looking at choice that we're understanding that because in the current CalTPA, it must be a classroom of X amount of students, generally 25 to 30 students, higher obviously if it's secondary. I think looking at the choice would be that there is an understanding and there is a place to honor what we heard from the focus groups in that settings are not a traditional classroom. And sometimes if we're looking at inclusion and co-teaching models, those can become small groups based on what is the placement, again, that idea of placement for the candidate. And I think it's just to allow that flexibility in which we're honoring what focus groups have said, but also understanding that it isn't the traditional classroom that we may see in the general education CalTPA. So I just wanted to add that as possible further understanding.
Chair Sloan? So one thing I am thinking about with respect to the classroom setting, in the general education TPA, candidates are also required to demonstrate that they're eliciting student responses and responding to student responses, and oftentimes that is a video segment of a small group where they are interacting with 1 or 2 or 3 students. And it's very illuminating to be able to see how they're building on students' understandings and asking the next questions and things like that. And I like what you said, Amy, about sometimes there are settings where students need to be protected and we need adaptations and modifications. I always get those two terms mixed up, modifications, adaptations. But that maybe that's the language if there are settings that require that. And yes, I think there are people who don't like to be videoed while they're teaching. I'm one of them, but I also know and see teacher candidates in my own campus. The video has become so ubiquitous in their teaching. They're constantly setting their iPhones on a bookshelf while they're going around and talking to candidates. I think most of our teacher candidates are far more comfortable seeing themselves in video than they were 10 years ago, that's for sure. But regardless, this is about having an opportunity in a performance assessment to get access to their performance. And we have seen in our decade plus of this teaching performance assessment that the video has been valuable in that. Whether it will be for this special education CalTPA, I think is yet to be determined.
I'm just thinking about the settings I've been teaching in, and I think a piece of this is parents. I mean, I think about our school setting and other school settings I've been in, and there would be a large number, significant number of parents that would opt out of having their child in the room while a special ed teacher was doing a TPA. I mean, I think that is not a small concern, and I know our school's not unique. I don't.
So going back to Chair Sloan's comment about the ubiquitousness now of video, so there's a huge cultural shift going on, as you all are probably aware of, anyone who knows a teenager right now or young adults. They don't seem to have any, not always, but some are very comfortable with videography, and they're not afraid to videotape a lot of things. And we haven't, I can tell you, 20 years ago there was a lot of discussion and support. The technology wasn't very easy to use. Now in this day and age, in the last 4 or 5 years, we really haven't had any pushback from anyone around the video component in the current gen ed assessment at all. I can tell you at all. And even yesterday when we were working with 65 faculty from around the state at our faculty training, great conversations going on about how more they want to use video more, not less, in their program. And that it's such a powerful tool because they can look at practice together in real time. They can stop it. They can talk about it. They can think about it. They can, right? So it has become a methodology for practice, and so many who can't, they talk a lot about the challenge of getting from the university out into the classroom. Now the teacher can easily video record their practice, bring it back to the classroom. They can all talk about it, and it has actually extended the amount of feedback candidates have gotten from their faculty and supervising teachers because of the methodology, and now everybody can do it on iPhone. So, I can tell you that it's been pretty much a methodology that has become embraced and is being used more and more, not less and less, and we just don't have those conversations anymore. So now, in this setting, right, we're in a whole new context, and we have parents and we have others that might say, I don't want my child involved, and that's always an option because you have to have permission. A parent always has the right not to have their child involved with this videography work, and then the teacher has to, not video record them. And we just talk about why that's so important. So we can vouch for the fact that if we're going to look at performance, video, especially now that the technology has come so far, has been a rich experience for most candidates. But there's some getting used to it. So in our APA world, they're still getting used to it. But it's starting to come along, and again, they're starting to find that it's a rich way together, collaboratively, to look at practice and particularly performance, right? Remember, a lot of our early critique on performance assessment, the early versions, was that these are really assessments of writing. The candidates are writing everything, and we were looking at their capacity to think about teaching and write about it. And so we've been able now with technology and other ways to expand the use of looking truly at performance by using video. So I just sharing that with you.
I became national board certified in 2005 in a very rural community, and video was something that was necessary. Having students who were families were there illegally, and nobody, I actually held a meeting with the parents, and they were excited that their children were going to participate in that. And this was many years ago. And so, and I see a lot of teachers using video to improve their practice, to share their, I have an enigma, something that's happening in class, and sharing it with other colleagues after they videotape it. So I see the opposite, actually, of a high comfort level. Teachers who privately submit some of their work with the students knowing that they're being videotaped for lesson studies on the teaching channel and things of that nature. So it's definitely a tool that's used to critique the practice. And a teacher or a student teacher can explain, the majority of these students opted out for these reasons. The parents didn't feel comfortable, and that can be part of their assessment as well, right? Like, how well do they know their students, and how do they respect the community that they're in, and, comment on the fact that this was an issue.
I'm not saying that videos are not an effective tool to use. I just am saying that in my field experience, parents of special ed children will hesitate to have their children videotaped. That is all I'm saying.
And so in the interest of time, and probably good to wrap this item up, do we, is this an action item? Should we give you some further direction? It says here that it's an action information item, but
so from the most part, direction about the overall scope of the work and development was sought, but a proposal to adopt changes to the assessment design standards is the action we asked you to take. And the question is, do we need that to happen today? Do we need more information to emerge from the panel? Has your question been resolved, or where are we with that? Are you ready to adopt, or do you want to wait?
I would prefer to wait or alter the language on the video just a little bit. The way it sounds right now is you could write about it, you could video, you could do anything. We don't know yet. Is that okay?
Do you know how you'd like to alter it? I mean, if you...
I don't think we've heard any problems with 1E.
And I liked Ivania Soto's recommendation also about including somebody, an ELD specialist. I think that would be wonderful to have that feedback live in the work.
Got it?
And I think, though, I think what we want, I suppose, is that we don't want to require a video either unless it's appropriate. And I know that's what the design standard says right now, correct? So is there some way we can, somebody wants to put forward some language that says something about, I don't even know what it would be. We would request that it be video unless...
We could let it stand as it is because we do have the accommodation option. If you are currently teaching in, for example, an incarcerated setting, you can communicate with evaluation systems, and we can provide the accommodation in your assessment that you can submit an audio tape versus a video recording. That exists. So maybe this is a step too far, or we could take this to the design team and ask them to grapple with it and come back to you. We're happy to do whatever you would like.
So you could adopt the first part if there's no objection to it, and we'll be back on the second part.
Yep.
So do we need to make a motion or yes?
You're going to adopt a change.
Do I hear?
I just have a question. So if we adopt 1E, is that saying that then that we would have two separate TPAs, or just that if you're, because as it reads right now, number 2 says for ed specialist candidates, so it's like something different. So does that mean that it would be considered two separate TPAs, or that it's just still the same one, but you just have to do your work in those areas?
What we were trying, I think, to do, and maybe we need to work on this language some more if it's not clear, but we were trying to say that if you're an education specialist and you happen to be working in your field work is in an elementary setting, then you could do your content in elementary content areas. If you were coming into being an ed specialist and you had done your CSET in a single subject area and you wanted to work in a high school setting, you were doing your clinical practice in a high school setting, and you were working with science students, your content could be science. So it was opening it up basically to say, wherever you are as an ed specialist, your content that you're currently working to teach would be acceptable. I think that's what we were trying to say. But if it's not clear, we could fix.
That's good. That's just to make sure that it wasn't. We weren't putting something in that was saying now we have two. Okay,
right.
That's good.
No.
Okay. Then can I get a motion to approve 1E?
So moved.
All right. We have a motion. Is there a second? Commissioner Kung? So there's a motion and a second. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Anyone opposed? Abstentions? Okay, motion carries.
Thank you very much. We appreciate your feedback.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good job. We can take a few minute break and then start closed. So yeah, we're gonna adjourn the. No, wait. I think actually what I think it requires a day to say.
Okay, so we will recess the educator prep. We'll recess the educator prep until tomorrow morning, and I turn it over to our chair.
All right. Okay. I'll now recess the general session. Members of the commission will go into closed session. The general session will reconvene at 8:30 tomorrow morning.
Take a 5-minute break.